OCO, and welcome to Exploring Cherokee History. My name is Kristen Mosher, and I'm the Cultural Collections and Exhibits Manager for Cherokee Nation Cultural Tourism. Now featured at the John Ross Museum is the exhibit Djallaghi 101, Cherokee Preservation Efforts in the Classroom. This year marks the bicentennial of the Cherokee Syllabary, and to celebrate that milestone, we are exploring many topics related to the Cherokee language. Today, we're going to explore the Cherokee Language Master Apprentice Program, or CLMAP. We have with us today Ryan Mackey, a CLMAP administrator, and Jake Chavez, a CLMAP student. Hello, how are you all?
Yo.
Good.
So, Ryan, do you want to say a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself?
Sure. Sio Nagadawun. Hi again, huh? Wade, Chilak Gandawadong. My name is Wade, or Ryan Mackey, and we started this program about 5.5 years ago, almost 6 years ago. And we've been growing ever since. We are really happy with the learners and how they're learning to speak pretty good Cherokee. We knew when we started the program, it wasn't going to be perfect. We knew that nobody was going to walk out of here speaking like a first language speaking elder. But over the years, not only have we produced really proficient second language speakers, but my language has increased dramatically. I started learning about 20 years ago, and it's really accelerated. My ability to speak has really accelerated quite a bit over the last few years.
Great. And Jake, do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Sio Nagad, Jake Gobo Seho, Walel, Dawadon, Jalek. Good. I'm glad to be here today. My name is Jake. Thank you.
Ryan, can you tell me what exactly is the Cherokee Language Master Apprentice Program?
It's something that we've been wanting for a decade or more. However, when we initially started it, we knew it was going to be kind of a crazy sell. The idea was we were wanting people to learn to speak Cherokee almost as a daily chore. So when folks came to work, they would speak Cherokee throughout the day and they would go home and practice at night. We would do this indefinitely. When we got the green light to submit a proposal, we decided to focus on creating people that were going to pass the language on. So we wanted to create Cherokee teachers. That way they could go out and take what they've learned and pass it on to people in their communities and in their homes and possibly in the workplace. We knew it was kind of a big deal to pay folks to learn the Cherokee language, so we wanted to make sure that what we invested in our learners would be returned back to the Cherokee people.
What can you tell me about the daily lessons in the program, or what happens daily in the program?
Well, when we first started, we created kind of a curriculum overview that tied our daily activities with lessons that had to do with our community as well as what went on in the world around us. But we realized that level of abstract language would have to be built. So the first part of it was focused on getting learners to be able to talk about themselves, their family, their body parts, their feelings, their thoughts, and to be able to describe their environment. After the first 6 months, we began to focus on how to use the language to communicate with other people. The third 6 months, we wanted to expand it out into how to interact with people from the community, interact with their environment professionally. And then the final 6 months, we focus on more abstract ideas about why we do things, the value of things. And we would have the language at that point to be able to use conversational Cherokee to teach lexicon that was tied to some of the more deep philosophical values of the Cherokee language. The first year, we focused on trying to push people to learn as much language as possible. In the second year, we asked them to come into the classroom and help teach the new recruits as they learn their beginning Cherokee. So the second year folks will be expected to act as teachers in that regard. And so the language techniques that we use are all conversationally based.
So the program itself actually lasts 2 years, correct?
Yes, ma'am. 2 years, 8 hours a day.
Wow, that's a lot of time to devote to it. So Jake, what made you want to enroll in the program and devote so much time to learning the language?
A lot of different things, I guess. You could say my grandma's a fluent speaker. She grew up in Marble City, Oklahoma. And my dad doesn't speak, but he's, I guess, what you call a passive speaker, where he understands a lot of the language, but he can't produce as much as he understands. And so I grew up around it, I guess you could say, and I just took a notice to it. And as I got older, I just realized that I just wanted that piece of my identity. And so this program, I would come around this program before I was accepted into it. I was at NSU here at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, and I would come down here. It's just down the road from there, and I'd visit sometimes, get to know some people here, and kind of see what it's about, and I just saw that it was a nice environment, a nice learning environment for adults. And I figured once I'm done with school, I can just apply to that, hopefully get in, and 2 years there, and then the rest of my life I can just dedicate to learning and maybe even teaching if I feel like I can really do that.
That's great. So Ryan, since the program is immersive, what can you tell me about some of the teaching methods and maybe some of the hurdles that students have to overcome?
When we first started the program, we went as hard and as fast as we could and tried to cram as much lexicon down our learners' throats as possible. And we were staying entirely in Cherokee, and that was our goal. And the students seemed to be enjoying themselves, but at the same time, it was clear that they were getting headaches. Sometimes they would go outside almost sick at their stomach. So there was an emotional element or component that we hadn't initially factored in. So we slowed down a little bit for the first 6 months, but by the time they hit the second 6 months, it's entirely in Cherokee. And we push as much language as possible. Our first mission, I suppose, was to come together and figure out what needed to be taught. And then we had to figure out, if we're going to teach these really abstract ideas and sometimes complicated themes, what language are the learners going to need to be able to understand this communication? So we had to work backwards. We had to scaffold the language in reverse. So in order to teach what we ultimately wanted to teach, we had to figure out what we needed to teach them so they would be able to understand these other ideas. So scaffolding is a large part of our effort. When we thought ahead and we determined what was needed, we also realized that repetition was absolutely important, but not just random repetition. Repetition in context is what's necessary. So we talked about something called 40 times in 40 different ways. And it ends up being a lot more than 40 times and a lot more than 40 different ways. But if you can provide the same words or similar words in different contexts, it helps build the complexity of the language slowly in a way that's understandable. So comprehensible input was a very key aspect of what we try to push. You have to pick something up and tell people what it is. And then you can teach them the language around that object. And using whatever context that you're in to build their vocabulary is key to being successful. So we have target words and target phrases that we teach, but at the same time, we try to teach those using words and phrases that we've selected to help with the learning process. So you have to think almost multidimensionally, what they're going to need in the future, what they need to understand what's going on, and you have to loop that in. And that looping, going around to the same content again and again is very important to make sure that it goes from their short-term memory to their long-term memory. And since we're using the language to teach the language, it means that we need to be able to have conversations with our learners. And so our speakers are very naturally adept at conversations. What we learned is that we had to find a way to kind of back it off a little bit, to kind of give them an intermediary language so that they wouldn't be hit full force with the most complex Cherokee that our speakers would naturally produce. So that's one of the reasons why we use second language learners in the classroom, because the second language learners have been there. They've had to go through this process, and sometimes they know how to demonstrate the language or explain certain words and phrases in a way where other learners would be able to pick it up more easily.
Jake, what do you feel has been one of the most important lessons that you've taken away from the program so far?
Probably just the sense of community that we have in our classes and just in the program in general with each other. We don't see a lot of each other, not right now, but just because of the COVID and stuff. We we try to maintain social distancing and all that and wear masks. And which I'm glad, because before, we were just on Zoom, and it was kind of like this. We were trying to have to learn and just study through Zoom, and it wasn't really copacetic for me and a lot of us. And I noticed a real change. Even the teachers noticed a real change when we got to the class. Things just kind of stuck easier, and things were a lot easier to explain, it felt like. And you weren't trying to communicate with a lot more through the chat feature on Zoom, or communicate just through pictures that we had on there. So it was definitely a lot easier to do that. And just so our community, once we got into the classroom, was just tenfold. We were a lot closer, a lot easier to communicate with each other, and they didn't feel like strangers, because for the first 6 or so months, I was there. My class were virtually strangers to me, because I hadn't seen them in person, and so just the community aspect is really vital, I feel like.
So I actually want to touch on two things that you mentioned that I actually didn't have down in my notes, but I just thought were some really good points. One is that with language being so, especially with Indigenous languages being so intrinsic to the culture, when you're teaching the language, you're not just literally teaching a language. And you kind of touched on that with the sense of community among the students and the administrators and the teachers. And so I just wanted to kind of see what your thoughts were on that, Ryan, of if that's, an accurate description of learning Cherokee, is that you're not just literally learning how to speak Cherokee, but you're also learning to be Cherokee in a way.
We are lucky. We're fortunate. We have students from different backgrounds. Jake here, he comes from a very culturally embedded family. He got to listen to Cherokee growing up. He has speakers in his immediate family. And then we have folks on the other side that haven't had speakers in their family for generations. So there's a balance that has to be struck between the different backgrounds of our learners. Also, we have Cherokee language that pervades both our churches and our ceremonial grounds, and they're integral into our spiritual traditions. So when you have something that's just as charged as it possibly can be, so emotionally charged when it comes to spirituality, you have to kind of be careful about teaching culture. Some of the philosophical ideas about both church and the ceremonial grounds are spoken about in context in the classroom, but we wanted to make sure not to focus too strongly on any one family or one community's tradition. So we also look to subsistence. We look to different games and activities that people can play. So there are different aspects of culture that we use to provide the context for our language learning. We know that it can't be a completely sterile classroom environment. That's not where Cherokee lives, and it's an artificial thing to try to teach Cherokee in a classroom environment. So the more we go outside, the more we interact with each other, the more cultural activities that we have, the stronger the language is going to be embedded in our learners. The reason that I wanted to learn Cherokee so much, even though I grew up with it in my background and I heard it as a young person, I didn't speak it. And I pursued our culture as hard as I could. And some of the elders I was speaking to, they were telling me that the only way that I would really understand the culture is to understand the language. And what I learned is that to get to the deepest, most valuable part of the culture, you have to be able to understand it in its context. Where the culture lives and where the culture thrives is in our language. And as people learn the language, they start to see that natural relationship between language and culture. And neither one can really exist without the other.
So I know that with the last year has been incredibly difficult, and I know Jake touched on that as well. It sounds like that normally what you would do is you would all be together in the classroom, every day learning and teaching the language. So would you say that COVID has been a specifically hard hurdle to overcome? Because I know that so much of language is also, it's not just in what you say, but how you say it, facial expression, mannerisms, and things like that. And so especially with masks and being limited to Zoom calls and things like that, is that maybe harder to overcome than it has been in the past when you've been able to be together more often?
Absolutely. I mean, what Jake said is 100% spot on. We've been in Zoom, well, we were in Zoom for approximately a year, almost a year to the date. We had about 2 weeks without some overlap. But Zoom is not the way to learn Cherokee. It's a social language. Communication is a social interaction. And we did the best we could using Zoom, but it was an artificial limitation that was imposed upon us. We mobilized our efforts as quickly as possible. We provided the technology and access to connectivity to ensure that our learners and our speakers were able to be in session. But nobody can stay in session 8 hours a day, not when it's online. And it's hard in person as well, but we take breaks throughout the day. Through Zoom, the majority of the lessons, they were, over a live format. However, we had to take a lot more breaks, and we also had to expect our learners to do work on their own, to take the resources that were provided and have to do some homework to make up for the time that they weren't in language contact with each other. Now that they're back in person, even though they have to wear masks, the fact that they're here all day and they're engaged in the language has allowed their language to grow dramatically. It was a slow process of trying to learn how to teach online that has ultimately enabled us to survive through the pandemic, but it was certainly a challenge, and we had to learn how to adjust our teaching styles as well as our delivery.
That's kind of a great metaphor for the Cherokee syllabary is, how it's had to adapt to new technologies. And so in the last year, orally, the language has also had to adapt a little bit as you're teaching new speakers to go out into the community. So, Jake, what advice would you give to somebody who's interested in either applying to the CLMAP program or enrolling in Cherokee lessons in general? I know that we have a lot of resources online, which I can give the website in just a second. I know we have online courses and online resources. So what advice would you give to somebody who maybe doesn't have any background in Cherokee language and they're interested in learning more?
Just it's never too late to start learning. Whether you're young or old. If you know a little, if you don't know any, just take a class if you're interested. It's hard, it's time consuming. It's just like any other language, but it's going to have its own unique hurdles. Cherokee's just really hard. Especially now that we're losing a lot of speakers and not everybody has that availability to themselves. So if you have an opportunity to learn from a speaker, especially, but if it's just a class, even just use that opportunity to capitalize on it if it's something that really interests you. For me, it was just I felt like a part of me was more or less missing, I guess I could say, and I wanted to have that connectivity with my grandma's side of the family, and so this is something that really just kind of drove me through passion. Some people approach it a lot of different ways, so I respect all of that. But yeah, if you're interested in if you have any opportunity to learn from somebody, use it.
Well, I want to thank you both for, again, agreeing to be with us today and to tell us more about this program. If you want to learn more about the Cherokee Language Master Apprentice Program and other language preservation efforts by Cherokee Nation, visit language.cherokee.org. If you are in the area, please visit the Jollagee 101 exhibit currently on display at the John Ross Museum in Park Hill, Oklahoma. To learn more about this exhibit and our other exhibits commemorating the bicentennial, please visit CherokeenNation.com. As always, thank you for joining us today. Wonderful.